Clint Harrison had grown up with the rhythm of the land pulsing through his veins. For as long as he could remember, his family's farm, nestled on acres of rolling fields and dotted with ancient oaks, had been his sanctuary. Every sunrise found him greeting the day from the weathered porch of his farmhouse, the scent of freshly cut hay and rich soil filling his lungs. The meticulously stacked hay bales in the barn and across open fields were not only practical necessities for winter feed, but also symbols of time-honored tradition. Each bale, carefully arranged in the same pattern his grandfather had taught him, embodied the sweat and perseverance of generations. Clint wasn't just a farmer. He was a guardian of a legacy. The farm was his pride and joy. Every furrow plowed, every bale stacked, told the story of honest work and deep connection to the earth. However, over the past few years, a new and unwelcome force had begun to infiltrate the serenity of his rural life. Whispers and murmurs about an overreaching homeowners association, HOA, had spread through the nearby community, and at its helm was one woman who reveled in wielding authority, Keren. Keren, self-appointed and supremely confident, strode through the neighborhood in her meticulously pressed skirts, armed with an ever-present clipboard and a rigid belief that every property must conform to her exacting standards. To her, Clint's sprawling farm, with its weather-beaten charm and traditional hay bale arrangements, was an abomination against the pristine, manicured ideal of modern suburban living. In her eyes, even the slightest deviation from her vision of order was grounds for correction and fines. The tension first crystallized one crisp autumn afternoon. Clint was inspecting his barn when he noticed a figure emerging from the dust of the gravel driveway. It was Keren, her eyes narrowed in disapproval. "Mr. Harrison," she began in a tone that brooked no argument, "I need to discuss the improper stacking of your hay bales." Clint's hands, roughened by decades of work, tightened on his worn cap. "Improper stacking? These bales are arranged just as my family has done for generations. They're practical and safe, and they've fed our livestock for years." But Keren was unmoved. According to the updated HOA guidelines, your current configuration not only disrupts the visual harmony of our community, but also poses a potential fire hazard, she declared, producing a freshly printed memo adorned with the association's insignia. "You're required to restack them in the approved pattern immediately." A hush fell between them as a few passing neighbors paused to listen. Clint's jaw set in quiet defiance. "I respect tradition, Keren, and I respect safety, but these methods have stood the test of time. I won't be bullied into abandoning my heritage for the sake of your arbitrary rules." Her eyes flashed with indignation as she retorted, "The rules apply to everyone, regardless of how long you've been here. If you refuse to comply, you'll face fines and further action." With that, Keren turned on her heel and strode away, leaving Clint standing amid the scent of hay and the weight of an impending battle. In that charged moment, the divide was stark. The deep-rooted legacy of a proud farming family versus the modern, uncompromising tyranny of a self-appointed HOA enforcer. Clint's heart pounded not just with anger, but with determination. He knew that every bale on his farm represented more than a storage solution. They were the embodiment of his family's honor, and he would defend them at all costs. And as the fading light of the autumn sun bathed the fields in a golden glow, a silent promise was made. This conflict was only the opening salvo in a war that would test the very soul of the community. The morning after that fateful confrontation dawned with an unsettling air of inevitability. Clint awoke early, as was his habit, to begin his day's work among the fields. But before he could even load his tractor, a heavy envelope, bearing the unmistakable crest of the HOA, was taped firmly to his farmhouse door. With a sinking feeling, he tore it open and found a notice: a fine of $750 for violating community safety standards and for failing to conform to the prescribed hay bale layout. The legal jargon was dense and designed to intimidate. Outside, as if to punctuate the threat, Keren stood on the edge of his property. With her arms crossed and a smug smile playing on her lips, she watched as Clint read the notice. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Harrison," she stated coolly. "You have been warned." Clint's response was measured, forged by years of hard labor and tempered by life's relentless challenges. Keren, these methods have been in use long before you set foot in this community, he replied, voice steady. I'm following a time-tested tradition that works perfectly fine for my operations. This fine is nothing more than an empty threat. But Keren was undeterred. Later that day, as Clint was repairing a fence along the property line, a black sedan pulled up. Out stepped two inspectors, HOA appointed enforcers, who began to methodically scrutinize every inch of Clint's property. Clipboards in hand, they measured the spacing between hay bales, took photographs of the barn, and even examined the soil around the fields. Every action was a calculated move to undermine Clint's autonomy, turning his cherished sanctuary into a case study in alleged noncompliance. Word spread quickly among the local farming community. Neighbors, though sympathetic to Clint's plight, hesitated to intervene for fear of retribution from the seemingly omnipotent HOA. Yet even as these whispers filled the air, a spark of rebellion was kindling. Clint, determined not to be cowed by bureaucratic overreach, meticulously documented every moment, snapping photos, recording conversations, and noting the time and manner of each intrusion. With evidence in hand, Clint filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office, citing local ordinances that recognized traditional farming practices and protected long-established methods. His complaint was calm and respectful, a stark contrast to Keren's aggressive posturing. Yet the HOA was not ready to back down. Within hours, the county office acknowledged his submission, and soon after, Keren's smug smile was replaced by a steely glare as she redoubled her efforts. That evening, as dusk fell over the farmland, Clint sat on his porch reviewing the day's events. The fine, the inspectors, and Keren's unyielding threat, all of it painted a picture of a regulatory machine bent on erasing the very identity of his life. It wasn't just about the hay bales. It was about an assault on tradition, on independence, and on the right to live according to one's own time-honored practices. In the quiet of that night, with cicadas singing in the background, Clint resolved that he would not let these arbitrary rules dictate the fate of his heritage. He would fight back, not with anger alone, but with irrefutable evidence and the support of a community that longed for fairness. And as the farmhouse windows glowed softly against the darkening sky, it was clear that the first power move by Keren was merely the opening chapter of a far greater conflict. In the days that followed the initial crackdown, the pressure on Clint's farm escalated. The fine was just the tip of the iceberg. Rumors began to circulate among local farmers. The HOA's methods were growing increasingly draconian. At a local feed store, Clint overheard other farmers grumbling about sudden, unexplained fines and demands for modifications that clashed with generations-old practices. It wasn't long before Clint discovered that Keren wasn't acting alone. She had allies on the HOA board who seemed willing to push even the most unreasonable regulations. Late one rainy afternoon, as Clint patched up a section of his fence, a trusted neighbor, old Mr. Jefferson, pulled him aside. In a low, conspiratorial tone, he whispered, "Clint, you're not the only one being squeezed. They're pulling numbers out of thin air and funneling money into some secret fund. I've seen records that don't add up at all." The revelation struck Clint like a bolt of lightning. His fight was no longer about a mere misinterpretation of safety standards. It was about systemic corruption. Motivated by a mix of indignation and a steadfast desire to protect his legacy, Clint began an exhaustive investigation. He visited town hall meetings under cover of darkness, scanned through public records, and even managed to secure a few damning internal documents from a reluctant HOA board member who feared Keren's wrath. Every piece of evidence pointed to a disturbing pattern. Fines issued for trivial reasons, funds that disappeared into unaccounted accounts, and an overarching intent to force every property owner into submission. As the days turned into weeks, Clint's investigation began to uncover even more startling irregularities. Anonymous tips revealed that Keren had been pressuring board members to sign off on amendments that allowed her unfettered control over community assets. In hushed conversations at local diners and over phone calls late at night, Homeowners admitted that they had been coerced into making voluntary contributions to cover supposed deficiencies in their properties, money that ended up lining the HOA's coffers and, more suspiciously, Keren's own pockets. Clint documented every conversation, every memos he was able to photocopy, and every recorded interaction with the inspectors. His meticulous dossier grew, each page a testament to an organization that had long abandoned its original purpose. Instead of serving the community, the HOA had devolved into a tool for extortion and control. One afternoon, as a storm gathered over the fields, Clint received a terse, official-looking letter demanding that he alter the layout of his hay bales by the end of the week. The letter cited a newly discovered fire hazard, a claim that would later prove to be a prelude to a more shocking act. Clint's pulse quickened. He knew that if he complied, he would not only be sacrificing tradition, but also setting a dangerous precedent for every homeowner who cherished their individuality. Refusing to be bullied, Clint organized a small meeting with a few trusted neighbors. In the dim light of a local barn converted into a meeting space, the farmers exchanged stories of similar injustices. The collective outcry began to form a grassroots movement, and Clint emerged as a reluctant leader. He assured them that he would continue gathering evidence, and that together they could hold the HOA accountable for its abuse of power. By the end of the week, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Clint's anger had crystallized into resolve. He finalized his dossier and prepared to take his findings to the county zoning board and local media. What had started as an isolated conflict over hay bale stacking had now ballooned into a full-scale battle against a corrupt regime determined to strip the community of its heritage and autonomy. As night fell and the storm unleashed its fury over the farmland, Clint stood outside his farmhouse, the howling wind echoing his determination. The fight was no longer just his. It was for every person whose life was being upended by arbitrary rules and unchecked authority. And in that moment, with a storm as a backdrop, Clint Harrison vowed that he would not rest until every crooked rule was exposed and every dollar misappropriated was returned to its rightful owners. The tension on Clint's farm reached a fever pitch one fateful morning when the unthinkable happened. As the first rays of dawn broke over the fields, Clint stepped out to survey his beloved hay bales, only to be met with a sight that made his heart sink. The once proud stacks of hay, arranged in their customary, time-honored pattern, were engulfed in flames. The blaze was fierce, consuming the precious bales with a ferocity that left nothing but smoldering embers and a trail of bitter smoke across the fields. Clint's blood ran cold. In that instant, he realized that this act was no accident. It was a calculated move, a signal from the HOA that defiance would not be tolerated. As he raced toward the barn for shelter, he saw Keren emerging from her car, her face twisted into an expression that mingled satisfaction with cold determination. "This is for the safety of the community," she proclaimed, as if the destruction of his family's legacy were a necessary sacrifice for some greater good. But Clint knew the truth. The burning of his hay bales was an act of pure malice, a blatant overreach by Keren to force him into submission. Anger surged through him as he dialed the local fire department, and even as the flames roared, he began capturing evidence with his phone. The smoke, the heat, and the shocking image of his ruined legacy were all documented meticulously. Every moment of that catastrophe was a testament to the extent of the HOA's tyranny. Within hours, the news of the arson had spread like wildfire. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance, their faces etched with disbelief and horror at the sight of Clint's smoldering fields. For many, this wasn't just an attack on a property. It was an assault on tradition, on a way of life that had nurtured the community for generations. The burning hay bales became the rallying cry for those who had suffered under Keren's rule. Clint's fury quickly transformed into action. With the evidence in hand, he organized an emergency meeting with local residents. In the community center, a repurposed barn that once echoed with laughter and the sounds of camaraderie, he laid out the photographs, video footage, and eyewitness testimonies. "This is Arson," he declared, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Keren did not just break a rule. She broke our trust and our way of life. The room erupted in outrage. Long-suffering neighbors recounted their own experiences of arbitrary fines and unjust penalties. The evidence was overwhelming, and the collective anger of the community now had a focus. Clint announced that he was not only filing formal complaints with the county, but would also be pressing charges for arson, a move that would force the hand of local law enforcement and expose the full extent of the HOA's criminal behavior. As the day progressed, legal advisors and local media began to take interest. Headlines in the nearby papers spoke of HOA tyranny and arson on the farm, and soon the county fire marshal arrived to investigate the blaze. In a dramatic public confrontation at an impromptu town hall meeting, Clint presented the charred remains of his hay bales alongside the damning video footage. The evidence was irrefutable. The fire had been deliberately set, and all signs pointed to Keren's orchestrated campaign of intimidation. Keren, cornered by the weight of public opinion and mounting legal scrutiny, tried to maintain her facade of authority. "This is all in the interest of community safety," she insisted, though her words now rang hollow in the face of such undeniable devastation. The community, once divided by fear, now united in a single, resounding demand for justice. Clint's decisive strike had shifted the balance of power. He had not only protected his legacy, but had ignited a movement against the HOA's abuse of power. As dusk settled over the ruined fields, Clint stood amidst the charred remains, a lone figure determined to reclaim his heritage. The act of arson had turned the tide, setting the stage for a battle that would reach far beyond his farm and into the very heart of the community's struggle for fairness. Refusing to accept defeat, Keren launched one final, desperate maneuver designed to reclaim her crumbling authority. In the days following the arson, as law enforcement and local media closed in, Keren resorted to tactics that blurred the lines between regulation and outright criminality. Determined to discredit Clint and salvage her reputation, she staged a late-night incident that would prove to be her undoing. It began with an anonymous call to the local police. Keren claimed that there was suspicious activity at Clint's farm, a supposed attempt to set another fire, this time targeting community property. The call was detailed, alleging that unidentified figures were seen tampering with electrical lines near the barn. In truth, Keren had orchestrated the scene herself, hiring a dubious private investigator to create an alibi for her misdeeds. Her plan was to portray herself as a concerned citizen forced to take drastic measures in the interest of public safety. When the police arrived on the scene, they found nothing more than the lingering smell of smoke and scattered ashes from the recent blaze. But Keren's insistence on following procedure, coupled with the fabricated evidence provided by her hired man, briefly shifted suspicion away from her own actions. Clint, however, remained resolute. Already in possession of the damning footage of the arson, and now aware of Keren's suspicious behavior, he prepared to expose her once and for all. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, a packed session that had become the stage for a community uprising, Clint took the floor with quiet authority. "We have all seen the evidence of what happened here," he began, his voice resonating with the collective grief and anger of his neighbors. "The fire that destroyed our heritage was not an accident. It was an act of arson, and I have reason to believe that it was orchestrated by someone who once claimed to protect this community." Clint then played the security footage he had painstakingly collected. The video revealed a shadowy figure near the hay bales just moments before the fire broke out, a figure whose mannerisms and build were unmistakably those of the private investigator working for Keren. As the footage unfolded, the room fell deathly silent, every eye fixed on the screen. Murmurs of shock and dismay rippled through the crowd. Realizing that her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling, Keren attempted to interject, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "This is all circumstantial," she cried, but her protests were drowned out by the rising tide of community outrage. In a final panic bid to shift the focus, Keren produced a hastily printed statement from a so-called legal advisor, alleging that Clint was involved in illegal land modifications, and that the fire was part of a larger, undisclosed scheme to defraud the HOA. But Clint, ever composed, countered by presenting documents and testimonies from longtime residents, that verified his adherence to traditional practices and his long-standing commitment to the community's welfare. As the meeting reached its climax, it became clear that Keren's desperate move had backfired. The police, now fully apprised of the inconsistencies in her story, opened an investigation into the incident. The very act of staging a false alarm, coupled with the irrefutable evidence of her role in setting the Bales ablaze, compelled local prosecutors to take action. For the first time, Keren faced not only the wrath of a united community, but also the full force of the law. In that charged atmosphere, as neighbors demanded accountability and justice, Clint made a decisive announcement. He would press charges for arson. "This isn't just about protecting my property," he declared. "It's about ensuring that no one in our community is ever forced to live in fear of unchecked power and abuse." His words reverberated throughout the room, sealing Keren's fate. With her final, desperate move exposed and the evidence laid bare for all to see, Keren's reign of terror began to crumble. The courtroom battles, the media frenzy, and the steady advance of justice all signaled that her days of unchecked authority were numbered. In the aftermath of the explosive revelations at the HOA meeting, the tide of public opinion turned decisively against Keren. The once feared enforcer of draconian rules now found herself isolated as homeowners and local officials alike rallied behind Clint's call for justice. The community, emboldened by the evidence of arson and corruption, organized a series of town hall meetings where grievances were aired openly and demands for reform were laid out in unequivocal terms. At one such meeting held in the refurbished community hall, longtime residents recounted decades of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. With every story shared, the collective anger grew, transforming individual frustrations into a resounding call for accountability. The turning point came when a majority of the HOA board members, who had long operated under Keren's shadow, finally broke ranks. In a dramatic vote that echoed through the hall, they unanimously moved to remove Keren from her position as HOA president. The vote, a public repudiation of her tyrannical rule, was met with thunderous applause and heartfelt cheers. The fallout was swift. Within days, the city council, already under pressure from outraged residents, announced an investigation into the HOA's practices. Auditors were brought in to scrutinize the organization's financial records, and what they discovered was a labyrinth of misappropriated funds and unauthorized expenditures. Keren's luxurious lifestyle, once sustained by the illicit flow of money from unjust fines, was rapidly collapsing. Her bank accounts were frozen, and several of her personal assets were slated for seizure. In a series of public hearings, Clint's evidence, photos of the charred Bales, video recordings of the staged emergency, and the damning security footage, was presented before a panel of county officials. The hearings were broadcast live, and for the first time, the community witnessed the full extent of the HOA's abuse of power. The once mighty Keren, once so confident in her unassailable authority, was reduced to a figure of humiliation and despair. Local media outlets picked up the story with fervor, and soon headlines blared warnings of HOA tyranny and arson on the farm. The public outcry forced law enforcement to act decisively. Keren was formally charged with arson, and several of her closest associates on the board were implicated in the corruption scandal. In a matter of weeks, the very institution that had once imposed draconian measures on Clint's farm began to disintegrate from within. For Clint, the victory was bittersweet. The loss of his Bales was a painful reminder of the cost of preserving his way of life, yet their destruction had also become the catalyst for a movement that reclaimed the community's autonomy. As the HOA crumbled, new leadership emerged, one committed to transparency, fairness, and the preservation of tradition. The residents rallied to form a reformed community council, one that would honor the values of the past, while ensuring that no single individual could ever again wield such unchecked power. In the days that followed, Clint could often be seen on his rebuilt porch, a symbol of resilience, sipping coffee as he watched the neighborhood slowly heal. The charred remnants of the Bales, though a painful scar on the land, served as a monument to the community's hard-won victory over tyranny. Every conversation on the street, every smile shared between neighbors, was a testament to the power of unity and the triumph of justice over oppression. As investigations into the HOA's practices gained momentum, local and state authorities left no stone unturned in their pursuit of justice. In a swift and decisive response, the county levied steep fines against the HOA for violating multiple municipal codes and misusing funds meant for community improvement. The investigation uncovered evidence of widespread corruption, illicit transactions, forged documents, and a pattern of arbitrary fines that had cost residents dearly over the years. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of the affected homeowners, with Clint's dossier of evidence serving as a keystone in the legal battle. The legal proceedings not only targeted Keren's personal involvement in the arson and fraud, but also held the entire HOA structure accountable for its systematic abuse of power. Several board members were called to testify, and their testimonies painted a damning picture of an organization that had strayed far from its original purpose. Throughout the legal maelstrom, Clint emerged as a steady and determined force. His decision to press charges for arson and his willingness to share his painstakingly gathered evidence proved pivotal. With the support of community advocates and local legal experts, he spearheaded efforts to secure a judicial ruling that would mandate the dissolution of the corrupt HOA structure. In court, as the judge reviewed the overwhelming evidence and the testimonies of countless homeowners, a series of rulings were handed down that not only imposed severe penalties on the organization, but also paved the way for comprehensive reforms in community governance. The state's attorney general joined the investigation, and a task force was established to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations in the region. This task force's mandate was clear: to restore trust, ensure transparency, and prevent any future abuse of power. The legal consequences rippled through the community, serving as a stark reminder that no one was above the law. By the end of the proceedings, the old HOA was effectively dismantled. The fines imposed, the lawsuit settled, and the new governance model instituted all signified a dramatic turning point, a public exorcism of the tyranny that had long haunted the community. Clint's final power move had not only saved his farm's legacy, but had also laid the groundwork for a future where homeowners' rights would be fiercely protected. The collapse of the HOA and the legal reckoning left Keren's personal life in shambles. Once revered within the organization for her uncompromising enforcement of rules, she now found herself facing the full force of public humiliation and legal sanctions. Her lavish lifestyle, funded by the very extortion she had imposed on her neighbors, crumbled as assets were seized and bank accounts frozen. The fallout from the arson charges, now indisputable thanks to the evidence Clint had gathered, ensured that Keren's future in community leadership was, quite literally, over. Rumors quickly spread throughout the community about the extent of her downfall. Neighbors recalled moments when Keren's threats had intimidated even the most steadfast residents. Yet now those same residents exchanged knowing glances as they recounted her latest misfortunes. Publicly, she was forced to resign from her position as HOA president, and the board's decision to remove her was announced amid a flurry of media coverage. Her once imposing image, carefully cultivated over years of dictatorial enforcement, was now reduced to that of a cautionary tale. The final blow came when Keren was offered a position at another HOA, an ironic twist that underscored her fall from grace. Now working as an assistant property manager, she was subject to the very regulations she had once enforced with such zeal. In a bitter moment of poetic justice, Clint happened to pass by the modest office building where Keren now worked. With a wry smile and a hint of satisfaction in his voice, he remarked quietly, "I hope you like following the rules." The comment, shared among neighbors later that day, resonated as the ultimate vindication for those who had long suffered under her authoritarian rule. Even as legal proceedings continued and the community rebuilt trust, Keren's personal and professional reputation lay in ruins. The once feared enforcer had become a pariah, a living reminder that unchecked power always meets its match in accountability and truth. In interviews with local media, residents spoke not of vindictiveness, but of a collective relief, a sense that justice had finally prevailed over years of tyranny. In the weeks and months that followed Keren's downfall, the community of Maple Grove began to heal. The charred scars left on Clint's farm served as both a painful reminder of what was lost and a symbol of the hard-fought victory over injustice. Neighbors, once fearful of arbitrary fines and intrusive inspections, now gathered freely at community events, sharing laughter and stories of the past while looking toward a future of fairness and mutual respect. Clint, ever the resilient steward of his family's legacy, rebuilt not only his hay bale stacks, but also his sense of hope. The new community council, born out of collective struggle and determined to uphold transparency, ensured that every voice was heard and every grievance addressed. As he sat on his porch one golden afternoon, watching the sun set over fields that were slowly regaining their former glory, Clint allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. At a celebratory block party organized by the newly reformed council, neighbors exchanged playful jabs and humorous memorabilia from the dark days of the old HOA. A local artist even unveiled a satirical painting depicting Keren in her former authoritarian guise, a piece that quickly became the talk of the town. The laughter and camaraderie that filled the air underscored a simple truth. The community had reclaimed not only its rights, but also its spirit. In one particularly memorable moment, as Clint was approached by a group of longtime friends, one of them held up a mock violation notice, a tongue-in-cheek reminder of a past now relegated to history. For having too much freedom, the notice read in bold, playful letters. Clint smirked and replied, "They really tried." The remark, delivered with both humor and a deep-seated pride, encapsulated the journey they had all endured. As the festivities wound down and twilight draped its soft veil over Maple Grove, Clint looked out over the land with gratitude. The battle against tyranny had been long and bitter, but it had also forged a stronger, more united community. In the silence of the approaching night, with stars beginning to pierce the dark canvas above, it was clear that justice, though hard-won, had paved the way for a future defined by respect, tradition, and true neighborly love. Fade to black.